We all know Napoleon. Conquered half of Europe, went to Russia, army froze to death, got kicked out to Elba, but then came back and Charisma 100 his way into having the French army put him back in charge. Then got wrecked again at Waterloo, and exiled a second time. But what less people know about is his much more less competent nephew, Louis Napoleon, also commonly referred to as Napoleon III. So Louis was born in France, but grew up in exile because the Bonapartes were not so welcome back in France at the time. In Switzerland, he became an army officer, and during this time, he also began to delve into politics, and really got into the revolutionary ideas of his uncle. So logically, well, in his mind at least, was that if he returned to France in the style of Napoleon during the 100 Days, the French people would rise up and hand the keys of the country to him. He goes to Strasbourg and actually got the garrison there to defect to him, but that lasted all of a day until the rest of the French army arrived and put that down, which meant he had to flee back to Switzerland. But since he got kicked out of the army, he traveled to all these places and then settled down again in London. So did he live a peaceful life in exile in London? Nah, he thought that for some reason the whole replicate the 100 Days plan would work again and hired a ship to sail to Boulogne. Yeah, this time was even worse than the first, since the garrison there didn't even let him land, and he was thrown in prison. While in prison, he contributed articles to regional newspapers and magazines all over France, becoming quite well known as a writer. He also maintained a mistress at the time, which honestly having a mistress while behind bars is like the most French thing ever. While he was in prison, pro-Napoleon sentiment was beginning to rise in France. And Louis decided to capitalize on this. So what is his brilliant plan? He disguised himself as a laborer carrying lumber and literally just walked out of the prison. He fled to London and quickly resumed his place in British society, and of course had a bunch more affairs. In February 1848, Napoleon learned that King Louis Philippe, faced with opposition within his government and army, had abdicated. Believing that his time had finally come, he set out for Paris on the 27th of February, departing England on the same day that Louis Philippe left France for his own exile in England. When he arrived in Paris, he found out the Second Republic had been declared. Napoleon ran in the second elections of the new republic and got a place in the National Assembly. The new constitution of the Second Republic called for a strong executive, and a president elected by a popular vote through universal male suffrage. No woman though. The elections were scheduled for the 10th of December, 1848, and Louis Napoleon promptly announced his candidacy. He gathered a bunch of veterans of Napoleon's war to help promote his campaign, and swept the vote. So upon taking office, as a flex, he titled himself Prince President, rather than just mere president. Now, Louis saw a lot of conflict with the National Assembly since they opposed his "give all the power to me" thing. So he organized a coup with some officers and set it for the anniversary of the Battle of Austerlitz. And third time is a charm, I guess, since he succeeded this time. He ran a big national plebiscite to determine if the coup was legitimate, which he won. But keep in mind the results probably weren't the most accurate. But he took it anyways as proof to allow himself to rewrite the constitution into a new, more authoritarian form, and declared himself emperor. He sided with Sardinia Piedmont in its unification wars against Austria, and while he was content to let the Italians unify, they just couldn't have Rome as he wanted to keep his support from the French Catholics. This pissed off the Italians though. He also tried to install Habsburg as the King of Mexico at one point, but that failed miserably. He also began to get ill around this time. At the same time, the nation of Prussia was up and coming and headed by a chancellor who wanted to see a united Germany, which had Napoleon worried. Napoleon went around Europe trying to find allies, but got no's, nine, and a niet. Napoleon had his second big diplomatic humiliation in 1867 when he asked the King of the Netherlands to sell him Luxembourg. But the Prussians got hold of this information and passed it on to the British, who promptly put pressure on the Dutch to say nay. He tried to increase the size of his army, since Prussia's was twice as big, by expanding conscription, but all the revolutionaries in his government said non and shut that down. But that and the fact that he had no allies did not deter Napoleon for gearing up for war against the Prussians. In July 1870, Bismarck found a cause for war in an old dynastic dispute. Queen Isabel II of Spain had been overthrown and exiled to France. The new government of Spain considered several candidates, including Leopold, Prince of Hohenzollern, a cousin of King Wilhelm I of Prussia. Napoleon said no to the idea, but Bismarck did his thing, and Charisma 100 Leopold to accept the candidacy. Then Leopold got cold feet and withdrew again. But this still had the intended effect and infuriated the French. So the French ambassador to Prussia, Count Vincent Benedet, met with the Prussian king, where they actually had a fairly productive conversation. But Bismarck got a hold of the transcript and did his thing and edited it to make it seem like both sides were hostile to one another, and then linked it to several newspapers. The plan worked, and finally the French declared war on the 19th of July, 1870. Despite being so ill that he couldn't even ride a horse, Napoleon decided to go with the army to the front as commander-in-chief. Now, the French mobilization went disastrously, while the Germans were able to quickly move 518,000 men to the border. The French began to lose battle after battle, and when Napoleon telegraphed Paris saying he was going to come back, his wife basically called him a simp, and he agreed to stay in the front. The Battle of Sedan would be the final disaster for the French. The army surrendered itself to the Prussians, and Napoleon himself was made a prisoner of war. Napoleon agreed to surrender, and when news got to Paris of this, his wife basically said he should have killed himself, seppuku style, rather than surrender. She did have to flee though after a mob kicked her out of the palace, and surprise, surprise, the French had another regime change. Napoleon eventually got released and went to exile in Britain, where he died shortly after from gallstone complications. So, rip to her boy, but hey, at least he tried. Special thanks to patrons Skylar Weston, Ben Hughes, Zy Mandez, and Helipilot.